Hope you're all staying in as much as you can, staying safe, and keeping other people safe. Today I wanted to talk about some changes that are mostly affecting our online presence right now, but also apply to our system as a whole. After this video, we are no longer planning on going by the Storyteller System. Instead, we are picking up a name that we've all collectively worked towards and agreed on over the past couple years. We are going to be going by Keegan Quill on this account, on our social media in general. Something really important that we've learned over the past several years of therapy and of personal self-reflective work is that integration isn't as black and white or as linear as it always seems. Some people can integrate individual alters, two distinct alters into one. And we've been doing some of that over the course of the past several years. And sometimes you're just breaking down barriers between your alters gradually. You might share an experience, or you might realize, hey, I can relate to your feelings, I can empathize with this more than I used to be able to in regards to a specific alter and why they're doing what they're doing in your system. When it comes to our system and the 350 alters we've documented over years of therapy and self-help, it felt so often like we were just living our life in a blur, when we weren't rapid switching and barely able to keep ourselves grounded, and when we weren't escaping into the inner world that my mind crafted to give us a safe space. We were also struggling in the workplace, in school, and in interpersonal relationships just with other people that we loved, that we cared about. It took me years to accept my alters individually, to get to know them, to accept the ways that they were different from me, and it took me years past that to accept that we were an amalgamation of all of them, that all of their pain, their mistakes, their secrets, those were all mine. But it also means their growth, their strength, our connections, those are also mine. Individually, I still have specific alters. They come out, and there's still some of those differences that I've been familiar with and getting to know for the past several years of my life. But at the same time, it feels blended and it feels streamlined and it just feels natural. I rarely lose time anymore, if at all, and it feels like even when there are still individuals, we're okay with identifying and putting ourselves out there more as Keegan without feeling like we still are, kind of hiding in shame, because we still can and still choose occasionally to announce a specific alter being there. A few years ago, I really struggled to put my experiences into a cohesive narrative. There were too many gaps and so much dissonance, especially, trying to talk about my dissociation on camera. My alters would, we would rapid switch, we would zone out. I really tried with this channel, and I think that I really learned a lot in that process about tuning in with myself as well. Like I said, I don't consider myself fully fused, but the overall level of fragmentation and dissociation that my mind has been experiencing for so long is significantly decreased. When I was 17, I first got diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. It was like the mask that had kept me functional for up until then had just broke. It just snapped completely, and we were completely unstable. We couldn't ground. About 5 or 6 years later, and after lots of work with unblending and acceptance initially, and after that, getting to know my alters beyond just the differences that I first accepted, getting to know their experiences, communicating more deeply. Finally, it just kind of gradually brought us all together until we didn't want anymore to have just one of our hundreds of alters or a fully fused individual. We're still honoring ourselves as individual alters, but we're also affirming ourselves as a collective individual, just Keegan, just us, me. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about healing integration. Some examples being that it's comparable to alters dying, or that it's just going to happen spontaneously when the alters involved who are fusing don't want it to. Another example is that, it's all or nothing. And I mean, honestly, for me at least, it's been super gradual. It's been like journals and fronting logs and, digital notes left in my phone and draft after draft of comprehensive system lists, whether that be on paper or on a Google Doc or anything. Just so much outward communication. We really worked on that a lot for years and years and years. I mean, what really catalyzed all this change for me was just adjusting my priorities and my personal accountability. Before I go any further on that tangent for myself, I want to stress that an individual being dissociative or mentally ill continually does not necessarily mean that they're lacking in priorities. It doesn't mean that they're an irresponsible or unaccountable person. And, there's a lot of factors there. There's support from loved ones, and there's access to professional help and self-care, and just tons and tons of outside circumstances that I can't even begin to list them all, because that's not something I've personally experienced, every one of them. But things like income and discrimination, those all can also factor in, and they can play a pretty significant role as well. And not to mention, different people will just have different goals in their recovery. So this is just an example of what changed for me. When I got diagnosed with DID, and even a lot of, just mental illnesses, and even just mental illnesses before then, I found people online, DID communities or online mental health, mental illness circles online. And I felt like they got me, for once. And sometimes what I would do was just, latch onto them. Sometimes this culminated in, unfortunately, toxicity and dependency in my relationships. This would mostly culminate with, just a couple of people that I was closest to, especially like, a romantic partner, a best friend. And to this day, I have a lot of remorse about the toxicity and the codependency that kind of led to. And I just kind of actively work to remedy that, and I've apologized to everyone that I could reach out to, things like that. For a lot of the people that I was having that problem with, it was a lack of boundary awareness on my side. I wasn't cognizant of the fact that I was putting more on them emotionally than people should onto just someone else who's often dealing with the same stuff. And that really hurt a lot of my relationships from my teenage years till the time I was about 19 or so. Pretty much the people I was closest to, that often ended up happening with.
There's a difference between reaching out for support from your loved ones and becoming reliant on them, to the point where they feel like they need to be there all the time, that you wouldn't be okay if they weren't. That was the line I crossed. I encourage you to talk to your supportive loved ones about making sure everyone's emotional boundaries are respected, but I don't mean that you should never be able to talk about your feelings.
And I was also diagnosed at the time with borderline personality disorder. At this point in time in my recovery, I attribute most of the underlying feelings that were leading to the symptoms of BPD more to, just general the DID causes. And just like people with BPD aren't inherently toxic, everyone has the power to control their individual actions. It doesn't always mean that you can just recover in the blink of an eye like that, but it does mean that every person out there has the power to choose what they do and what they put out there towards other people. When I realized that the ways I had been acting, even if they were normalized in some spaces, they weren't healthy, I took it upon me to go and try to apologize to some of the people that I'd hurt in my past, notably a person that I'd hurt in my past. It can be really hard to know if a toxic person is actually committing to changing. So my partner that I was talking to, that I was apologizing to at the time, didn't really let their walls back down all the way, understandably so, until they could be sure. Frankly, a lot of people who have been toxic like that are just trying to rope their exes back in, and a lot of times people don't change much. And so, going into that apology, number one thing that I needed to know, that I needed to accept, was they might not accept me back into their lives, and I was going to have to be okay with that, and I was apologizing because I was like, wow, that was how I was being was not okay. And I really started pouring my heart and soul back into healing at that point too, both a little bit before I was apologizing and also continuously after they did accept me again into their lives. I was journaling, I was working in self-help books, and I was going to, professionals as regularly as I could, and I stabilized my lifestyle. A lot of people know I'm a big advocate for system accountability, taking responsibility for the actions, the mistakes of your individual alters. But after a while, that also just kind of so happened that I stopped mentally prioritizing the individualization of my alters. It still felt important to me in a way because for so long I had, tried to dull it down. I tried to dial it back. That once I was accepting my alters, it seemed so important to me to say, this is who this alter is. This is who this very different alter is 100% of the time. It might sound like a non-existent difference. It's just, I went from focusing on, I know that they're different this way, to saying, I accept that we're different, and I also accept that we share a collective experience. I also was finally able to embrace other elements of that experience that I'd previously struggled more to accept, that my memories of my life weren't necessarily complete, and that, the pain individual alters felt was also my own. And that ultimately all of our experiences belong to an individual collective. And this also just pieced together some better understandings of societal issues that we'd also struggled to really grasp at the time, We finally understood that all of our alters, regardless of what they look like internally, are part of a white collective experience, a white body, and that the alters are also white. We learned to accept ourselves as being transmasculine. Even though there were alters who were in, a lot of complex stages of denial. And even if there are still some alters who felt like, no, I just am feminine, we realized that overall the collective is transmasculine and does want to transition. We began to build more friendships locally, and we fostered a lot of that sense of connection and community that had never really clicked in our brain before. And we finally also were able to foster a much healthier relationship with our partner, who is still the same one amazing human that we had been with for years before. And we found a sense of safety and community in other people and in ourselves that without all of this shifts for us, we wouldn't have found otherwise. And eventually the different cities of our inner world that were previously unable to communicate with each other formed what we call the Rowood Community Resource Center, which is at the center of our inner world now. And we are finally able to, come together, heal together, and just, it was very symbolic for us. And I will be the first to say that recovery is not linear. Relapses happened. Sometimes we would not respond to a certain stressful situation as gracefully as we had hoped. Time and time again, I had to take what I had learned from a past situation and reapply it to this one. And sometimes, considering the dissociative barriers, that was easier said than done. But on its most basic level, that's integration in and of itself. It's just breaking down some of those dissociative barriers between you and your alters. And it also helped a lot that in ways, especially in interpersonal ways, my home situation was very supportive. It was very constructive for me. I felt like I was being supported, but I also had to learn to not rely on just any one person. I finally had a little bit more of a network, and I felt like when things went wrong, I had options and I had support and I had love that was offered without terms and conditions. And it's through this newfound feeling of support that was healthy and balanced within my community, between myself and my partner, and in myself, between me and my alters. It's through this, that I was able to weather the storm and remain semi-stable through coping with and working through some past trauma, breaking off attachments with people who were hurting me, house fires and explosions, holding down my first long-term job even when it was definitely very rough, and, you know, kind of dealing with a long-term chronic health and financial crisis. And I guess learning those skills gave me a newfound ability to deal during this whole coronavirus pandemic that is affecting so many individuals. And of course, that is still a very stressful and upsetting situation. And I absolutely could not blame anyone who is struggling and who, for them, it's not that meaningful right now. I can imagine that, and I still see you. I still don't blame you for that one. And I mean, I guess that ultimately what that's coming down to is that, as triggering and very distressing as it can be, I'm learning to reintegrate and cope with those experiences as they're coming up. And that's just a very new level of being able to deal for me. And that's kind of when I finally pieced together this revelation, despite all of this going on. And because of all of this going on, I have the power to do that. And I want to honor my parts, and I want to accept and grow from my past. And I still have distinct alters that range in how distinct they are, but ultimately we are Keegan. This platform will still exist, videos on DID and mental health will still exist, but it's really likely that that's not going to be all that I talk about. And if that means my channel is no longer for you, it no longer suits your fancy, I get it. This is going to be a learning curve for me too. So thanks for being here, thanks for listening to my story. And whether you're a system or not, whether you feel alone or have a whole community behind you backing you up, you have the power of all of the parts of you combined. All of your pain, your love, and your growth. Use it. Let it fuel you. And stay together.